I want to invite you to go with me to the book of Romans and chapter 9. So we've been going through Romans. We're in chapter 9. And this morning, Lord willing, we're going to complete Romans 9. I wanted to be able, we could probably split this into two messages, but I wanted to be able to be starting chapter 10 after the week that the team is here. And so Romans chapter 9, and so our goal this morning is to kind of give an overview of this chapter, finish out the sections we've not discussed yet, and then make some applications for how we would apply Romans 9 as a whole in our lives. This is a heavy chapter. This is in the deep end, and so thanks for sticking with us on this one. Romans chapter 9, I'm going to begin reading in verse 23, and we'll read to the end of the chapter. Actually, I'll begin reading in verse 22. This is God's word. What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he had prepared beforehand for glory. Even us, verse 24, whom he has called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. As indeed he says in Hosea, those who are not my people, I will call my people. And her who was not beloved, I will call beloved. And in every place where it was said of them, you are not my people, there they will be called sons of the living God. And Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, though the number of sons of Israel will be as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will be saved. For the Lord will carry out his sentence upon the earth fully and without delay. And as Isaiah predicted, if the Lord of hosts had not left us offspring, we would have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah. What shall we say then? The Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it, that is, a righteousness that is by faith, but that Israel, who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness, did not succeed in reaching that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as it were based on works, but have stumbled over the stumbling stone, as it is written, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone of stumbling, and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. This is God's word. Let's ask God in a prayer of illumination to help us. Oh, Father, open the eyes of our heart, Lord. We want to see you. This passage shows us your design, your plan, your purposes in this age, in the age to come, and in the past, in your promises. So, Lord, we need you to open our eyes to that. We want to see you. Open our eyes that we may behold these wondrous truths from your word. And, Lord, help us to apply it in a way that would please you. Make us more like you. Help us to take the next steps in our lives to put off sin, be renewed in the spirit of our mind, and put on the new man. Lord, help us to grow in our union with Jesus and recognizing it and applying it to us. And Lord, I also pray for those that are under the sound of this reading and this explanation of your word that don't know Jesus, that the Spirit of God would do the work that only he can do to call them to faith and repentance in him. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I'm wondering if there's any guys, particularly husbands in the room, that have had this experience that is pretty frequent with Jason I go through a day, I'm planning something, I'm kind of making other plans. Then I go over, talk to Jamie, and she says, oh, remember so-and-so and so-and-so are coming over tonight. Or remember we're going to visit so-and-so and so-and-so. And I'm like, wait, why didn't you tell me about that? And she says, we talked about it last night, or we talked about it at breakfast. You ever had that where you talk about something, you plan something, and then when the time comes, you're like, what? Or like if you have a teacher in school and they say, hey, you need to know these things. Eventually this is going to show up on a quiz. And then your first couple quizzes is not there, so you kind of forget about it. And then when it does show up, you're like, oh, mean teacher. You're like, told you, it was coming. You got to be ready. Anyone else have that happen? Or just okay, I'm assuming there's a few of us in the room. There's a little bit of that going on that God has, through his prophets, through the patriarchs, told us his plan for the future for drawing out a people to his name and who would be his people and how he was going to integrate that with not just Jews. But somehow when it starts happening in this early part of the church age, they're like, wait, what is going on with these Jews rejecting Jesus and these Gentiles accepting him, and how is this working out? And you're like, why didn't God tell us about this? And Paul is kind of saying, he did, like, a lot, and so he does that. That's really, in a nutshell, what's going on in Romans chapter 9. Paul is kind of giving a response and an apologetic for the gospel, because there's this huge question. So as he's explained God's righteousness and how there's this righteousness of faith and how we're unrighteous and how he's working about this to bring us this justification by faith, and how there's these implications and these benefits of justifications in Romans 5, and then the union with Christ and how that affects our sanctification in Romans 6, and how the laws fits in there in Romans 7, and how this adoption and this plan that God has and this golden chain, and how he goes to the foundation, that this didn't all just happen at once. Some of this, we're zooming out and seeing this in eternity past, this predestination and foreknowledge and calling and justification and then glorification, and how he's planning. And even though we might see some of those that are in eternity past, but just comes to the fruition where we see it in space and time at this calling and then this working about in their lives, is when we see it, that God's had this big plan, and it's connected to this, and he's going to bring this future grace. We're not going to be separated from his love. And then it's like, okay, so what about the Jews? I mean, didn't God make these promises before? And that's what he's doing. So some people would say, well, Romans 9 to 11 are kind of this big parenthesis in what he's doing in Romans. But no, he's really saying, hey, here's this big question. Let me defend this. Here's what God's been saying. This isn't something new going on. We've talked about this before, how there's this Jewish background in the church, and how now it's becoming primarily Gentile. And we talked about what happened historically in Rome and the kind of pastoral problem he's trying to address. And that's what Romans 9 to 11 is trying to answer. To show this, Paul gives some examples. He gives some examples. Here's what's kind of cool. And this is for those 3 points in a poem guys like me that like to divide things up in like a logical outline or whatever. That's kind of an old school dinosaur way of preaching, I guess. But Paul kind of does the same thing, at least that's how I'm seeing it, is that he gives this example from the patriarchs, and then he gives two quotes, two Old Testament passages. And then he gives like an argument about what's God's going, and he quotes from the Old Testament again. And then he goes to the prophets. He quotes a minor prophet and a major prophet here in the section we're looking at this morning. And he quotes back. So he's kind of rooting this and kind of giving these points and scripture to support it as he's walking us through this. So, and it's really coming down to what is the biggest obstacle to salvation. And it's the unbelief of people not believing in him and refusing to see that and stepping and tripping over him. So what happened in eternity past, some in the time now and some in the future. And so we saw this choosing of God between Jacob and Esau, between Isaac and Ishmael. And we looked at some of those questions in verses 14 and 19 last week about this question about God's justice and whether that's fair or not. And but we also want to make sure we're taking this whole section in a whole, and so that we're seeing this as a balance and in the tension, I believe, that is wanting to be there. And that these doctrines are not in exclusion to an evangelistic fervor, because the first 5 verses are highlighting this burden for souls, this passion for souls that Paul has for wanting Israel to be saved. And so we share in his theology, but we also share in his unction, this evangelistic unction that Paul has, that they are not in exclusion. I have shared and quoted a lot of folks that would be on the big God side of theology of Romans 9. And what I do not want you to think is that there's evangelistic people and then there are people that are really big on the sovereignty of God, as we see in Romans 9. Because if you look historically at evangelists and missionaries that have done great things for God, you will find that the majority of them came down on the side of holding a high view of God's sovereignty over salvation, that salvation belongs to the Lord. We could just look at a few in the last couple hundred years of the George Whitfields and the Jonathan Edwards and the William Careys and the ones that started a lot of the China inland missions, the Eric Littles. We look at all these ones. We can look at modern day, some of these folks that are seeing people saved and baptized. And I've heard some people, and I say that because I kind of for at a time was like, oh, those people aren't wanting to be saved and they're not evangelistic. And then I'm seeing some churches where, man, they're seeing people saved and being baptized. And I'm saying, but wait, aren't they the people that are like the frozen chosen? And I'm like, man, if that's what that is, sign me up, because I want to see people saved. And so that's a false dichotomy of passion for souls. In fact, I'm going to even say, as I said a little bit last week, that it actually fuels that, because we're saying anybody can be saved. As I said last week, think of the person that you think they're never going to come to know Christ, and pray and watch God reel them in. And so every Christian needs to have this burden for souls. And so the question comes up in verse 6, which is really the whole thesis of chapter 9, is, has the word of God failed? And that's really the question that's going on. And he answers that. Has the word of God, has God's promise to Israel failed? So he's trying to defend that. So he talks about God's promise and what that really was like in verses 6 to 13. And then this personal integrity of God in verses 14 to 23. And then we'll talk about his plan in verses 24 to 29 and see if we can find some more P's to alliterate along the way. And so really, has God's promise failed? And he answers in verses 6 to 13, which we saw already, no. Not at all, because God is working out his sovereign purpose in history. God's promise is here. This new community, has it failed the Jews? No. God's sovereign purpose in history has always worked out, and he shows this in the patriarchs, giving Isaac, Ishmael, Jacob, Esau, showing this, that the gospel is based upon this promise, not descent or who they were born by, is based on this promise, not how they achieved and what Isaac did versus Ishmael did. It's not based upon their merit. Jacob and Esau, both same parents, same mom, same dad, not even birth order, has nothing to do with that. And so he says it's not that. He says there are some people that are in Israel that aren't Israel, just like there are people today that are in a church, but they're not in the church. They're not in a church and call themselves in Christendom, but not in Christ. Has nothing to do with these things. True Israel are those who recognize and embrace Jesus as Messiah. And those who don't embrace Jesus were never true Jews in the first place. So they're saying, well, what about the Jews? And he's saying you can't say that the Jewish rejection of Israel was a sign or proof that God sometimes loses his sons and daughters that he predestined and chose. The ones who rejected Jesus were never with him to begin with. When he starts the class, he ends with every student. I mean, there's no dropouts along the way. So those he calls, so he's saying they were never in the class to begin with. And he gives us these purpose statements. So verse 11, this is the one of the purpose statements here. Verse 11, he says this. He just comes out and he's not shying away. He's not trying to skirt it under. He says, verse 11, though they were not born, they had done nothing either good or bad, Jacob and Esau, in order that the purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls. So he just says, hey, straight up, this is why. He did this so the purpose of election would shine out. So Paul raises some questions that he knows his teaching is going to bring up. And he answers those. So has God's word failed? No. He had this plan. God's promise was a promise. The salvation was based upon a promise of God. And then we get to verse 13. Okay, has his word failed? Is there injustice with God? And he said, no, because God's ways are just and salvation is merciful. This is what we talked about last week. So these people are trying to really question God's integrity, God's personal integrity. He's saying, no. So he says that we are saved by mercy, not justice. We don't want justice. We don't want what's fair. Because if we got what we deserve, we'd all be in hell. And as Wiersbe said, I quoted this last week, election is always totally a matter of grace. If God acted only on the basis of righteousness, no one would ever be saved. Mercy is something that we don't deserve. We don't get to say, well, God, you owe us salvation. He doesn't owe us salvation. He is God, and he is not, well, why did he make these people? No, God knew in their state that we have all gone our own way, and he is giving us what we justly deserve and what we earn. And mercy is not justice. We don't want that. We love this grace and mercy, and we boast in it. If God doesn't owe us salvation, he is free to give it to all, or to none, or to some. And so this is what he does. And so, as Wiersbe said again, God is holy and must punish sin, but God is loving and desires to save sinners. If everyone is saved, it would deny his holiness, but if everybody is lost, it would deny his love. The solution to the problem is God's sovereign election. And then he gave us in verse 19 and following there some examples of Pharaoh's hardened heart and how Pharaoh hardened his own heart, but God also hardened Pharaoh's heart. And so that we all, as Lewis says, lock the door from the inside. We all have gone our own way. And I gave that story from D. James Kennedy, the founder of Evangelism Explosion, about the guys that go rob a bank, and in robbing the bank, they kill a guard and a civilian. But before they went, one of the friends is there, and he's saying, guys, don't go. And finally, one of the guys he wrestles down doesn't go, and so that guy is not convicted. And so someone asked, well, whose fault was it that the other men were arrested and sentenced? You can't blame the guy for not tackling all of them or being able to wrestle all of them down. He did his best. So it is that those who go to heaven have no one to praise but Jesus, but those that go to hell have no one to blame but themselves. Salvation is by grace. And then the question in verse 20, is God choosing to save some? Is that inconsistent with his goodness? He says, no, remember your status, that he's the potter, we're the vessel. Don't think we're not smarter than God to figure something out. And so he gave us that purpose statement in order that God's promise of election should shine forth. But then another purpose statement, he says in verse 23. And here's another purpose statement. In order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy. He wanted to show off his mercy. And God offers that mercy. Salvation is by mercy. So then, has God's word failed? I mean, we come to the last section here. Well, then why haven't the Jews believed? And why are so many going against them? And why are these Gentiles being included in this? And this is where we come to verse 24 to the following now. No, God's word has not failed. Because God's promise has always included Gentiles and a Jewish remnant. This has always been God's plan. Remember, we talked about this before. You're forgetting this. And when you think, hey, wait, when did this come up? We talked about this, and he's going to show us where he did that. So there's some themes in this passage that we're looking at here, a few observations that we need to give insight here. The first is, and this is a key to studying the Bible, when you see a section and there's some phrases or words repeated, it kind of, little bells go off. So see, he talked about the calling of God in chapter 8. And then here in chapter 9 in verse 11, he uses this phrase about those that are called. Though they are not born, and yet neither good or bad, in order that God, the purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls. So contrasted with works salvation was the calling of God. So this calling is a key theme that we want to, and then in verse 24, when it says, even us whom he has called. The called. And then the other one is a key idea that comes up, is this idea of remnant, how God has a remnant of Israel. He's just said this before, he's saying this here. So he's basically saying that, hey, not all Israelites are really Israelites. He said that in verses 6 to 24. And then here he's saying, but not all Jews are chosen, but not all the chosen are Jews. So he's saying this was the plan. So if anyone is saved, you're not saved by race, you're saved by grace, okay? You're not saved by race, you're saved by grace. And so not all the Jews are chosen, and not all the chosen are Jews. Salvation is by God's grace. It's by God's sovereign grace. It's not by birth, it's by God's intervention. It's not by genetics, it's by God's grace. It's not how you are born, but whether or not you're born again. Salvation is about whether or not you embrace the promise or not. So the Old Testament prophets told about this. The Jews and Gentiles would make up the people of God. And this is where he's going here. And so God's choice of the remnant has always had this bigger picture of Gentiles among all the nations. And God is free to give his mercy, and as he's chosen to include Gentiles and to and pro tip here, he told us about that in the Bible, and he gives us a couple of examples here. As he says in Hosea, verse 25, those who are not my people I will call my people. He's quoting from Hosea 2. And her who was not beloved I will call beloved. In the very place where it was said to him, you are not my people, there they will be called sons of the living God. So if you've read the Old Testament book of Hosea, this kind of analogy. It's kind of weird a little bit. Hosea, there's a little question about Hosea, whether she's in prostitution before Hosea marries her or after, or at least there's a harlotry afterward. But it's kind of this allegory picture of the northern kingdom, particular Israel, the 10 tribes of the north, and how they keep going away from God. And so they name some of the kids like, not my people. What'd you name your kid? Not my people. Or no mercy. But then later on, they come back. And so it's this picture of what God's doing as he did with the northern tribes. And he's given us that picture there, particularly, and applies it to the people of God in the new covenant age. And so he's Hosea 22, verse 23 and verse 26. And then he also quotes Hosea 1, verse 10. And so he's given us this idea here. But then he gives this other idea that the Gentiles are now part of the people of God. This is kind of a cool thing that makes us even see this in the New Testament even in a greater way. So then he quotes again when he says, Isaiah, so a major prophet, cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the sons of Israel be as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will be saved. So he's saying, not all Jews are going to be saved. They're not all chosen. It's this remnant. For the Lord will carry out his sentence upon the earth fully and without delay. And as Isaiah predicted, if the Lord of hosts had not left us offspring, we would have been like Sodom and like Gomorrah. Basically, if God hadn't done this, we would have all gone this way, and we'd all been destroyed in our own sin. And think about this. This is if you've read through the Old Testament, you're going to see that especially the northern tribes, they're always going away and bringing in the worship of pagans and just really messed up stuff, and always these Asherahs and this pagan worship and mixing with other nations, and God carries them off, but he brings them back. And he connects them, and he has a restoration, and I think there's even some future aspect of this. But he's saying if they hadn't been, they'd been like Sodom and Gomorrah. And you've heard the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and how it's obliterated. It's there. I mean, so like we went to Israel in May, and I read this book about like finding Sodom, and there's this huge debate about like where Sodom is, and there's a lot of archaeologists. It's like this huge. There's a lot of literature out there, and it's about back and forth and things like this, and I kind of like to zoom out and don't miss the forest for the trees, right? It's like, well, why are they having such a hard time determining which archaeological site is where Sodom is? Well, because God did a really good job of like destroying that city, right? Like, so it's like the fact that there's people that are on the south side of the Dead Sea that are saying, okay, it's down here, and they point to some pictures there and some things. Okay, there's these salt, and there's like certain places that have this Gomorrah and Sodom even labels on it now, and there's some archaeological evidence there. Then there's these other people that are taking it from where they started looking and doing some research based upon the indicators in the text, where it says how Abraham and Lot look after, and they see these well-watered plains, and okay, that would be on the north side of the Dead Sea, where it's still spread out, and on the other side of the Jordan would be like where Jericho is. So the Jordanian side would be there, and they've actually uncovered a lot of things. They've even found things like when there's like really hot blasts of like lava type things, when there's like a glass almost formed. They've even found evidence of that in some of these walled cities and stuff like that. So like, okay, so there's, but at the same time, even though there's all this archaeological stuff, and you can look up this stuff and watch documentaries and read books about it all you want, the fact that they're arguing about this shows that what he's saying is, hey, if God hadn't had a remnant, we would have been like that, to where people are trying to figure out where we went and what happened to us. And so this mercy of God to save a remnant of his people, but he's saying that the Gentiles are part of this, and without this seed, we would be like Sodom and Gomorrah. Where are they? We would all be destroyed had God not, the God of everything, not had a plan. I love that phrase there, the Lord of hosts. That's the Sabaoth, or the host is not, we often think of angels as like sissy men that like wear robes and have wings and play harps and stuff like that, you know. But every time someone sees an angel, they're really scared, because they're like intense warriors. I think, is it Tomlin that has that, the God of angel armies? Is that who that sings that? The God of angel armies? I think that's kind of a good way of the angel armies, this Lord of hosts, these like warrior fighter spirit beings, these angels. The Lord of hosts, the God of angel armies, had not left us without this offspring. And so he says, we are his people. In fact, this is this familial, relational aspect. I remember my grandmother, before she passed, when people come in, and she'd be like, those are my people. Like, these are my people. This is part of there. So these images of how Christians work together, that we're brothers and sisters, and that this love for the brethren, that we're the people of God, that we are, the church is part of this, and he sees this. I'll give you a couple examples of this in 1 Peter chapter 2. If you go there, Peter applies this to the church. When he says in 1 Peter 2, verse 9, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you did not receive mercy, but now you've received mercy. So, and then he says, beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles, abstain from the passions of the flesh, which war against your soul. So, and he does this in 2 Corinthians as well. He talks about how we are the people of God and how he's called you a people to his name. And that he's doing this, he's drawing this people to his name. And then when he announces the bride in Revelation 19, this announcement of the bride, and then is described in Revelation 21, that there's this people of God that are represented by apostles and tribes. So there's this that God is grafted in the people of God. So church, we are the people of God, God's people. Christ's atoning work means that we are grafted in as part of the object of Christ's affections. He has brought this together. We are called the people of God, the chosen of God, chosen in him before the foundation of the world. That this being chosen and elected, the church belongs to him, the people of God. He purchased it, a people for his own possession, changed so that we are called saints, holy ones, in Christ, in fellowship with the Spirit, born again, meaning regenerated, generated, birthed again, called Christians, disciples, the brethren, this family. Peter addresses them in this time of struggling with identity when he says here, as we just read, you are that were not a people are now this people of God. He made you this through the redemptive work of Jesus. We are a holy nation, like Abraham's family and nation. We are the people of God. So we have this family identity. Are you part of the people? Are you part of the family? He invites you to. And no one's natural born. God doesn't have grandkids. You need to be born again. And so we are brothers and sisters. That's a special thing. It affects how we see unity. It affects how we see one another. Or as the old song says, you will notice we say brother and sister around here. It's because we're a family and these folks are so dear. When one has an heartache, we all shed a tear and rejoice in each victory in this family so dear. From the door of an orphanage to the house of the king, no longer an outcast, this new song I sing. From rags unto riches, from weak to the strong. I'm not worthy to be here, but praise God I belong. I'm so glad I'm a part of the family of God. I've been washed in the fountain, cleansed by the blood, joint heirs with Jesus. As we travel this sod, I'm part of the family of God. Like he brought this people, these Gentiles, to be part of the people of God. And so then we come to this final section here. Oh my, that clock, someone sped it up. Don't look at it. This final section here. So then there's this question, well, then why did Israel reject him? Why aren't more of them saved? And so he says, so what shall we say then? The Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it, that is the righteous, that is faith. But that Israel who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness did not succeed in reaching the law, because they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works. Here's why. The saving faith that swept through the Gentiles, but for many in Israel, they fell short of their own law. And verse 31 tells us, it is because they would not humble themselves before the gospel. Our own human-generated righteousness, the good things that we think about ourselves, are hollow and empty and they don't work. And so someone say, hey, why should God let you be part of his family? Why should he let you into heaven? Well, I've tried to do good. I try to be a good person. I try to this. I did religious things. I did all the things I'm supposed to do. I even prayed that prayer that I'm supposed to pray, and I did that. And someone else might say, well, I'm going to try to keep the law, but it's God's law. And as we saw in chapter 1 and chapter 2 and how we can attain to the law, and the law is this to reveal how sinful we are and how we can't obey it, but God sends Jesus to fulfill the law, to fulfill it in actively obeying, but also receiving the penalty of the law for us. And so we come to God as sinners. And we're like, the way we are, that's the way we are. We don't come to him saying, okay, I'm going to try to keep the law. And the reason that many have rejected it is because they wouldn't submit to that. Because we come to God as sinners that we are, just as I am, with empty hands of faith, trusting in Christ. Not saying I tried to do the law, I tried to be a good person, I had these sacraments done, I did this religious thing, I remembered a church stuff. And even in an Arminian sense, these people that say, well, I chose and I prayed a prayer, they're kind of in some ways just adding another sacrament in the same way. Well, I did this little magical prayer someone invented, or I did this. When what he's saying is that we come just as we are, we're sinners, and that we're saying, nothing in my hands I bring. Simply to the cross I cling. I'm just trusting Jesus. And that's expressed in a prayer, yes, but it's I'm not trusting in anything else. I'm trusting only in him. Or one hymn says, "O perfect redemption, the purchased of blood, to every believer the promise of God. The vilest offender who truly believes, that moment from Jesus a pardon receives." So we can't obey the law. We need one to obey it for us. He knows the secrets of our heart, and he gives us new hearts. And the gospel we have is powerful and saving, whether you're trying to keep the rules or break the rules. And so God is working this out. The gospel is God's righteous offer to make unrighteous people righteous in a righteous way forever. And so how can God justify a sinner and remain a righteous God? And he does this by giving us Christ. And unless we accept this, we're not saved. There's no salvation anywhere else. And so I want you to note here that a couple observations. That Paul is transitioning back into another section here, and as we'll get more into it in chapter 10. See, he's talked so much about God's sovereignty in chapter 9. He's kind of turning the corner and talking about human responsibility here. And there's a tension there. I gave the illustration about tension between your index finger and your thumb. That's not a problem to be solved, but tension to be managed. And you can hold things because you use that tension between the two. You don't need to cut one off or the other off. You manage that tension and use it. That, as Spurgeon said, I don't try to reconcile friends, that there's this human responsibility and God's sovereignty, God's total sovereignty. So he's saying the reason they didn't have this is because they didn't believe. Human responsibility is side by side with sovereignty, and God is fully sovereign, and yet we remain responsible to respond. He calls us to be his child, yet we remain responsible to repent and believe. Now, he gives us the faith and the repentance, but he calls us and makes us responsible for it to respond. Paul paints the picture of this roadway with a big stone in the middle when he says, I am laying in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. One writer said, when you trip over a stone, a big rock, and you trip over it in the middle of the road or whatever, at least one toe had to touch it, right? So everybody that's tripped over Jesus has encountered him in some way and rejected or tripped up over him. And so he's given us this here. Paul points out this picture. Some will refuse and stumble over it. Others will recognize Christ and find salvation in the Rock of Ages cleft for me. Let me hide myself in thee. And so are you trusting in that rock today? This choice of God, this calling that he said, you will be called. He's called this people. Those that are called. This is the call of God. And I mentioned this before, that God's calling, there's an internal and an external call of God. There's a general call and an effectual call. And the general call goes out to all through the preaching of the gospel, to a legitimate offer of the salvation to whosoever will. Whoever believes in him will be saved. But then there is an effectual call. And justification shows that this call is not general, because we are not all justified. And some of you have heard the general call many times, and you heard it many times before you heard that effectual call, that he called you. And this is where it happens in space and time. It's not in eternity. That for some of you, this happened as a kid in VBS. For some, this happened in Olympians. For some, this happened when you came to this conference a few years ago. For some, this happened recently in the last week or two. For some, I would hope that would happen today. We are the called ones. And so it is God that makes this initiative. Salvation isn't something that God owes us. It's something that he offers to all of us. But if we reject it, it's not on him. It's on us. And one day, God will harden the hearts and let go of those that have tripped over him. So let me close with just a few applications here of Romans 9. I'm adapting this a little bit from an author named Tony Morita, and also some things I've put in here. So the first is this. As we're finishing up Romans 9, here's some applications. Share Paul's passion for souls. Share in that. Have this passion for souls rooted in God's sovereign election. Allow this big God theology to increase your faith and confidence in God. It is this chapter that led a 34-year-old John Piper out of academic world and into the pulpit. Because he said this, he says, it is not simply to be analyzed, it will be adored. It will not simply be pondered, it will be proclaimed. My sovereignty is not empty to be scrutinized, but to be heralded. So this big God leads to big faith and doing big things for God. So share Paul's passion for souls in Romans 9. Number 2, trust God's word. Don't doubt it. The whole thesis of this was God's word failed. And then he says, no, this was part of God's plan. No, this is the way it was promised. No, this was what God had been working through the whole time. He told us about this, and he roots it in the patriarchs, he rooted it in this argument, and then also in the prophets, as we just saw. Trust God's word. You can have total confidence in God's word. Next, don't think anyone's a good candidate or a bad prospect for salvation, because God saves whoever he has mercy. He says, I will save whom I will save. Salvation should embolden us to share the gospel with others. We shouldn't try to guess who is someone who might get saved or not. I gave some stories of that last week. Application. Never get over the wonder of God's saving mercy for you. Don't let it ever be on your lips of it any credit to you. It is all God's mercy. Praise him with your lips. Praise him with your life. I think these are some really good applications for us as we conclude Romans chapter 9. Let's pray together.